The modern American public school system doesn't work well for educating free men and women. It does work well, however, for achieving the goal for which it was designed. The goal of the modern public education system is to produce a society of both consumers and cogs, citizens that participate efficiently in a producer-consumer economy for the stability and success of the modern industrialized state. The person educated by the modern education system tends to possess a utilitarian worldview, materialistic values, and a strong dependency on formal institutions. The modern government-regulated public education system is fairly new to the U.S. In the colonial days, public education was funded by local levies and regulated by locally elected school board members. The local public schools typically hired a young lady who had not yet married to teach the students at a local church or community hall. But in the early 19th century, there was a drive to democratize education to serve the new American Republic and its growing industrialization. Secular humanists like Horace Mann, who was the secretary of the Massachusetts State Board of Education and a U.S. representative, was part of the reform movement that wanted U.S. schools to provide basic universal education that cultivated loyal American citizens. To accomplish this goal, he looked to the schools of Europe. In his own research, he became fascinated by the militarized schools of Prussia. These schools aimed at universal education and used methods like age-based placement, full-time attendance, and inflexible curricula. The Prussian government intentionally structured its educational system this way to make sure the poorer majority of their population was docile and obedient to their industrialized state. Though Mann disapproved of the subservience the Prussians aimed at, he popularized the Prussian model in America, assuming incorrectly that educational tools can be neutral. In an attempt to cultivate educated free citizens en masse, Mann actually introduced a system in the U.S. that produces secularized and docile consumer cogs. Bob Peppermint Taylor, who is the dean and professor of political science at the University of Vermont, explains how different goals require different methods for educating students. He says, for the civic educator, the goal is to produce a particular kind of citizen. For the educator released from political goals, the goal of education is less to shape students than to develop their reason and knowledge so that they're able to take personal responsibility for shaping themselves as free and independent individuals, thinking through their own views, cultivating their own tastes, developing their own life plans, and becoming unique people. Although it's comforting to think that in a democracy, these two projects are complementary, Taylor says we like to say that democracy is the form of government that values free and autonomous individuals. Open-endedness in an educational process is worrisome from the political perspective. The temptation is toward an education with a known and satisfactory outcome, because free men and women are often a bit too unpredictable for the civic educator's taste. This means that to understand why the modern man has become so dependent on the state, we need look no further than our public education system. To use an idiom that kids used when I was growing up, we've been schooled. Schools as we've come to accept them, that is, an age-graded process requiring full-time attendance and an obligatory curriculum, literally create a dependent society, not a free society. Unfortunately, many Christian schools, even classical Christian schools, are simply modeled after these public schools, but adorned with Bible classes and weekly chapel. While the motivation of the Christian and private schools are to be admired, by copying the model of education introduced by Horace Mann, Christians are doing little more than repainting the grand ballroom of the sinking Titanic. One of the ways schools achieve this is by falsely equating service and substance, or another way to say it, processes and value. For example, in government schools, students and their parents are conditioned to conflate teaching with learning. In government schools, students and their parents are conditioned to conflate grade advancement with education. In government schools, students and their parents are conditioned to conflate diplomas, and in some cases test scores, with competency. In government schools, students and their parents are conditioned to conflate fluency with the ability to say something interesting, new, or intelligent. In other words, students literally get schooled into believing the fallacy of equivocation regarding process and value. By shaping the student's imagination this way, schools shape the entire culture's social imagination into conflating processes and services with real value. This is why institutional achievement, a degree or a diploma, is seen as legitimate, while independent accomplishments, real demonstrable knowledge, is usually suspect. It's also why people tend to offload responsibility onto formal institutions, for example, welfare and Social Security, instead of taking personal responsibility for their own lives. An example of this sort of thinking is described in Atul Gawande's fabulous book, On Being Mortal, in which he laments this same conflation of processes and values within the healthcare system. As a medical doctor, Gawande is perplexed that so many of his patients and colleagues conflate medicine and medical technology with real healthcare. He laments that death and the process of dying are literally resigned to the institutional management of doctors and morticians. In sum, schools create and legitimize student values and shape student worldviews, which essentially gives the school system a monopoly on the professional, political, and financial aspects of a society. And since schools do this by conflating processes and values, institutional achievement has become the norm. Thus, we've finally come to the place in our society where, other than the poor and the privileged, everyone now enters the world and leaves the world via an institution. Of course, institutions are not all bad, but the kind of widespread and deep dependency on institutions witnessed today should be troubling to anyone who values freedom and independence. The trouble is, we've all been schooled to give institutions, especially the state, irrational amounts of authority, often carte blanche authority, and most are not even aware that it is our educational system that is establishing societal standards for what is valuable and what is feasible. Interestingly, the political philosopher Ivan Illich argued back in the 1970s that our culture's increasing reliance on institutional care adds to our psychological impotence, leaving us less able to think or fend for ourselves. And this impotence disproportionately impacts the poor. Having written this in 1971 means today's generation has grown up in a system of institutional dependency that appears to be the norm, when the institutional nature of our society is really only about a century old. This, of course, brings to mind David Foster Wallace's fish story. In a speech titled, "This is Water," Wallace says, "There are two young fish swimming along who happen to meet an older fish. The older fish nods at them and says, 'Morning, boys, how's the water?' The two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and asks, 'What the heck is water?'" Irrespective of Wallace's personal philosophy, his fish story illustrates the fact that some of the most important realities, ones that we would think should be the most obvious to us, are usually the hardest to see. In closing, I would like to echo the philosopher quoted previously, Ivan Illich, and make a radical statement. If we want to preserve the culture of free men and women in this country, we will need to amend the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution with just two words: or schools. It should read, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or schools, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances." If that seems too radical, perhaps we skip that step for now and just get back to the biblically mandated work of taking responsibility for our children's education. We need to make sure they get the kind of education that develops their reason and knowledge so that they're able to take personal responsibility for shaping themselves as free and independent individuals. Individuals who can think through their own views, cultivate their own tastes, develop their own life plans, and become unique human beings who live for the glory of God in the kingdom of Christ.